Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. My name is Firaz Peer, and I'm currently here in Lexington, Kentucky, which is the homeland of more than 20 indigenous tribes, including the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and the Osage peoples, who are the original stewards of this land. By acknowledging the history of the people here before us and of the land we reside on, I hope we can take the first step towards honoring the land and building community with those who inhabit this land with us. If you'd like to learn more about how you can contribute, please be sure to support your local organizations that are working towards engaging with these Indigenous communities and creating awareness about their issues. Speaking of engaging with communities, the paper I'm talking about today is titled A Participatory Approach to Eliciting Local Values of Civic Data Justice. This study is related to work that I did with community leaders of the historic Westside neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta. Before I get into exactly what I did, I'd like to clarify what I mean by some of the terms in the title. Civic data or community data refers to qualitative and quantitative data about a community and its locale that is gathered, analyzed, interpreted, and used by members of a local community. It might include data about the local environment like water and air quality, education, public safety, and transportation. This is data that civic authorities own and make available to members of the community. Such data is becoming easily available thanks to the, the proliferation of the internet and the open data movement. But scholars have argued that despite the best intentions of stakeholders involved in open data projects, the process of making data open is inherently value-laden, biased, and structured to empower those who are already empowered. Injustice in, injustice out is a phrase that Johnson uses to describe open data projects that are rooted in unjust values, which then become a characteristic of the data they produce. Scholars have suggested several values that they believe are necessary for data projects to be considered a form of justice. For Johnson, data justice means addressing power asymmetries by having open access to and the ability to influence the underlying data structures, databases, processes, values, and politics that govern open data projects. For Heeks and Rankin, this would mean making the poor visible by considering structural, distributive, instrumental, and other forms of justice. Densig, Hintz, and Cable focus on data valence and ask that we consider security, autonomy, dignity, fairness, and sustainability as values of data justice. In addition to these values, Taylor argues that a vision of data justice that takes power and politics into account must necessarily also be rooted in local experience of the communities whose data we are dealing with. Taylor calls for conceiving values as local and contextually dependent, rather than global and based on a normative view of social justice. Gaining such a local experience requires engaging with communities who understand, uh, engaging with communities to understand how they use the data that is being created for them. And this is exactly what I did in this study. Taking such a civically engaged approach, the question driving this study was, what are the local values that community leaders in the historic Westside neighborhoods of Atlanta prioritize in their conceptualization of data justice? To answer this question, I organized 11 data literacy workshops with community leaders from the historic Westside. The workshop activities were inspired by those available on the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership and the databasic.io websites. The activities I selected were designed to go beyond the boring spreadsheet-based trainings that use art and instead use arts and crafts as an approach to building data literacy. I offer more details about the structure of these workshops and the activities I did in the paper. In the process of organizing these workshops, I collected several kinds of qualitative data. I took pictures and notes describing the artifacts that the participants created and also recorded audio of the discussions that took place during and after the activities. I transcribed the audio recordings and analyzed them using grounded theory to generate codes that finally led to identify their local values of civic data justice. I'll now briefly talk about a couple of the workshop activities we did before I list the values that I identified. During one of the activities that involved looking at public safety data, the participants observed that some of the data was inaccurate. The data in question was the number of burned structures in the Westside neighborhoods, which was far fewer than what the participants knew it to be. Participants who lived in these neighborhoods knew that the staggering rate at which old and abandoned homes were being burned down over the past few years. Unable to calculate the total number of burned structures in the Westside, participants believed that these numbers were being underreported. Their doubts made them question not only the usefulness of this visual as a resource, but also the values of organizations like the Atlanta Police Department that provided the data. Such criticality regarding data provenance, in which participants did not take data as given, was a consequence of the personal connections that the participants had with the data. These personal connections were also evident in a subsequent activity, which asked the participants to take a visualization and remix it for another audience. The visualization I presented showed the philanthropic dollars that had been distributed to different organizations on the Westside. The point of contention was that the visual showed close to $1 million given to two organizations, Construction Education Foundation of Georgia and the APD Urban Planning and Management LLC, which were both classified as working on housing. This number would seem admirable to anyone outside the community, but infuriated those in the room who were still helping out homeless teenagers, adults, and families on a regular basis. They could not fathom the fact that close to $1 million had been spent on housing since 2015, but the problem of homelessness remained unabated. In their remixed visualizations, the participants demanded to know what impact the investments had had on the community. This one on the left shows the total investments in housing adding up to zero in terms of impact. The one on the right demands to know stories about need and impact that were missing from the previous visualization. In each of these instances, there was some data that was missing, some that was unclear, and some for which we needed to do more research in order to understand what they represent. The community leaders in the room did their best to use their collective data literacies in order to make sense of the data. Observing the process through which they made sense of the data led me to identify the following as their local values of civic data justice. The first was to support the community's data infrastructure literacy. Second, to empower the community through data. And third, to foster accountability through data. I'll now briefly describe what I mean by each of these values. So what does it mean to support a community's data infrastructure literacy? Data infrastructure literacy refers to the social, historical, cultural, and political settings in which data are created and used, highlighting how such infrastructures influence data. The workshop activities offered evidence of how participants relied on their personal experiences and connections to the data when critically analyzing them. The workshops helped reveal how participants were proficient at considering the historical, social, and political aspects of how data are created and propagated. Each of the participants brought their own situated and partial perspectives, which contributed to a collective data infrastructure literacy. Doing justice to data would involve offering these community leaders a data infrastructure through which they could exercise their personal connections to data, support a plurality of interpretations, and collaboratively advance their perspectives about the data. A data infrastructure that would support the ability to create alternate interpretations of data or annotate existing ones might be one way forward. Such alternate interpretations could counter outside narratives which the community leaders felt dwelled on negative aspects of their neighborhoods rather than the positive ones. Creating data infrastructures requires that we do more than just relate data as is, but offer customized snapshots of data that could lead to specific actions for the community. In addition to facilitating action empowerment, also allows communities to choose the specific actions they would like to enable through data. This question of empowerment becomes even more important when one considers the amount of work that goes into building, maintaining, and updating data infrastructures. Maintaining data is part of the invisible work that goes into keeping a data infrastructure usable and is seldom accounted for. Empowerment through data also needs to contend with what happens when those who build and maintain the data become unavailable to perform their duties. Sustainability is a core concern of both data and design justice movements, as well as HCI more broadly. The concept of sustainability asks that we consider what it takes for technologies to continue to be used and thrive once the designer's involvement in the project ends. Designing data infrastructures is never complete and should therefore continue through use. A justice-oriented approach would require that we work towards sustainable, community-led, and community-controlled data infrastructures. Empowering data infrastructures are therefore those that lead the community towards action by revealing previously invisible perspectives and being continuously available. Scholars argue that when designing for accountability, the goal is to offer communities the data and tools they need to counter being dominated by other more powerful collectives. Sasha Constanza Chalk, in their call for design justice, argues that such accountability can be achieved by the full inclusion of people with direct lived experience of the conditions the design team is trying to change. Reminding designers and developers that interpretations suggested by data are always partial makes them more accountable for what they make. Designing for accountability therefore asks that we create data infrastructures that are community owned, can support their collective data literacies, help them make sense of their partial perspectives while being transparent about the data's provenance. So to summarize, in doing the study, the question I asked was, what are the local values that community leaders in the historic Westside neighborhoods of Atlanta prioritize in their conceptualization of data justice? To answer this question, I organized 11 data literacy workshops with 24 community leaders from the Westside neighborhoods in Atlanta. Observing the community leaders interact with data at these workshops allowed me to shortlist 3 local values of data justice. The first was that the data infrastructure support the community leaders' data infrastructure literacy. Second was to be empowered through data. And the third was to foster accountability through the data. While these values are local and specific to the Westside community leaders that I was working with, the process I followed to elicit these values does offer a blueprint for other researchers who are looking to build civic data infrastructures with their communities. As researchers looking to make data more easily available to our communities, I hope we can take this work forward by continuing to involve our communities in incorporating their values and needs in the data infrastructures that we build. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd like to invite you to read the paper, and also I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.